If you're a Pentecostal, you might be familiar with stories of Azusa Street. Stories of mass baptisms of the Holy Spirit, healings of hundreds of people, people being slain in the Spirit, things that as Pentecostals we just expect to happen today. But what if I were to tell you that there was someone holding revivals decades before Azusa Street that had the same things happening, including speaking in tongues? Once more, you can turn on your TV today or go on YouTube, and there are countless women ministering the gospel. But what if I were to tell you there was a time when that wasn't so? There wasn't that many women preaching the gospel. It was frowned upon even. I'm Jay Kennedy, and today's subject of Pentecostal history was a trailblazer, not just for women in ministry and not just for the holiness movement of the 1800s, but she was a mentor of the leaders of the early Pentecostal movement well into the 1900s. Extremely important, someone we all must know about. Today, let us look into the life and ministry of the Mother of Pentecost, Maria Woodworth-Etter. Now, she was born Maria Underwood in 1844 in Lisbon, Ohio. She had 7 siblings. She wasn't born into a very religious family, and her first religious experience wasn't until her parents joined a Disciples of Christ church when she was 10. Now, her father was a laborer and sadly died when she was 13 years old of sunstroke, severe sunstroke. When she was 13, she had to drop out of school because she had to help her mother take care of her siblings. Now, she reported that she felt the call of God on her life as early as the age of 8, but she didn't become converted until the age of 13 when a Dr. Belding did a revival at the Lisbon Christian Church. She got baptized, and at that baptism, onlookers reported that a light shone on her and it stayed on her, and to them that signified that she had a call on her life. Now, she said that at that time she felt God calling on her to preach to the lost, to call the lost sheep, as she said. She dedicated her life to God, but she couldn't go into ministry at that time, as the Disciples of Christ didn't allow women to go into ministry, didn't allow them to preach. So at that time, she actually started to hope that she could get married, and her husband could potentially become missionaries, and that way she could go into ministry and preach to the lost. Now, she met and married a man named Philo Harris Woodworth, a Civil War veteran, in 1863. They had 6 children. However, 5 of them tragically died at early ages. Only their oldest daughter, Elizabeth, would make it to adulthood. Now, her husband did not support her going into ministry or becoming an evangelist, and this did delay her. Now, in 1879, she made some friends who were Quakers, or Friends as they called themselves, and she began to attend some of their meetings. They invited her to some of their meetings. And at the meeting, she felt the call of God on her life again. At one of the meetings, she had a vision. In that vision, there were people who were on their way to hell and didn't know it, and she had a responsibility to minister to them. Finally, she would go into ministry. She held several local revivals, and people got saved. 2 churches would come out of those local revivals that she started. Small revivals that she started, 2 churches came out of that. Now, her first church association was the United Brethren, which was a Methodist denomination. But later on, she would associate, in 1884, she would become associated with the Churches of God Weinbrenner, which were founded by a man named John Weinbrenner, who was a former Calvinist minister. Later on, she would associate with the Methodist Holiness Church. After her first few revivals, she felt God begin to move on her to pray for people to be healed from being sick. She felt that God was telling her that if she began to lay hands and pray for people who were sick, more people would come. So she did. She prayed for the sick and they were healed. And soon she would have as many as 25,000 people coming to her meetings to hear her preach. This would start a mass evangelism movement in the late 1800s. In 1885, she started a campaign in Hartford City, Indiana. Now, she was slammed with some controversies and detractors, as always, both religious and secular. She was arrested for practicing medicine without a license. But so many people came to support her and show that they had been healed, that they had to let her go. She had psychiatrists claim that she was crazy because she saw visions. Even the New York Times wrote about her. But none of that slowed her ministry down. Now, her detractors would also start to call her the trance evangelist, because what would happen is at her meetings, when the Spirit would fall, some of the people in the audience would go into these trances, and people didn't understand it. So they began to accuse her of voodoo and say she was a voodoo priestess and all kinds of things, just to detract from her and say that she wasn't real. Now, her work was powerful. She noted various signs that happened in her revivals. She wrote 4 books in her life. There were all kinds of signs. There were healings. People would go into trances, and other signs. Going back a couple years to 1883, in one of her revivals in Fairview, Ohio, she wrote that after praying for a baptism of the Holy Spirit and fire, about 15 people came running to the altar. The people fell out under the power of the Holy Spirit. She reported that they laid there for 2 hours, even more. The older saints that were involved in her ministry said that Pentecost had come alive again. Dead churches began to come alive. Membership and attendance started to go up. Now, mind you, this is happening well over a decade before Azusa Street. This is happening well before Charles Parham started his ministry in Topeka, Kansas. This is before any of that. And she is experiencing all of these gifts, all the signs of the gifts of the Holy Spirit that are mentioned in Corinthians. All those things are happening decades before Azusa Street. In 1889, she acquired a large tent that could hold up to 8,000 people, and she started a campaign in Oakland, California. The revival exploded. The Holy Spirit could be felt on the entire crowd. Some people fell out under the power of the Holy Spirit. The well-dressed, the hoodlums, people of many walks of life embraced salvation, and they changed. People would experience visions from God. There was shouting and rejoicing. It was a great work. She saw this as a continuation of the day of Pentecost. Again, the detractors would strike at her. People would accuse her of hypnotizing people. She was called a voodoo priestess. Psychiatrists came at her again for her visions, accusing her of practicing medicine without a license. And that factoid of being charged of practicing medicine without a license is going to be a common thing amongst Pentecostals, as you'll see in later videos. Now, sadly, 2 great controversies rocked her ministry around this time. The first one came in 1890, when one of the men in her ministry prophesied that an earthquake and a subsequent tidal wave would hit the city of San Francisco in April. People in the ministry, getting excited and worked up, said it would be April of that year. Well, when April of that year came, nothing happened. It devastated her ministry. The man who said it was even arrested. Now, people would later argue that when a earthquake and tidal wave hit San Francisco in April of 1906, she would be vindicated, and that prophecy would be vindicated, but the damage was already done. The second controversy came in 1891, and sadly, this time it was in her marriage. Now, Mr. Woodworth had been taking advantage of her ministry, traveling along with her, not really supporting her. He would do things like sell pictures and ice cream and things like that along the mission trail. Sadly, he also had multiple affairs with women during these revivals. In 1891, he had an affair with a black woman and was caught. Maria divorced him for infidelity. Now, he would come at her and he would slander her because she would not pay him alimony, but there were several churches that came to her defense in that. She would get remarried in 1902 to Samuel Etter, who did support her ministry in large part. Now, towards the turn of the century, she began to also have issues with her denomination. She had become associated with the Methodist Holiness Church. When you look at her picture, she was very plain in her dress. She looked like a holiness woman. She kept her hair in a bun. She wore plain clothes. They loved that about her. They loved her revivals. However, they had an issue with all the signs that were taking place in her meetings. People being slain in the spirit and having trances and things like that. And she didn't understand them either and didn't root for them, but she understood that the spirit was moving and she wouldn't stop it. The denomination demanded that she stopped having those things happen at her meeting. She demanded she would stop the people, and she refused. So they removed her ordination. They took her license. But this would, however, not deter her, and she would soon find herself in league with a brand new revival starting in Los Angeles, California. At this time, the Azusa Street revival was in full swing in Los Angeles, California. Now, she was a bit skeptical of the revival at first, and she was not at Azusa, but soon she came to understand and realize it as a continuation of her work. Her first connection to the Pentecostal movement would be an association with F.F. Bosworth in Dallas, Texas. In 1912, he hosted her for 5 months for a revival. This revival was a great work, many healings, many signs, and it would go on to influence Pentecostal leaders such as Amy Semple McPherson, the founder of the Foursquare Church, and John G. Lake. John G. Lake took a liking to her, calling her Mother Etter, and he said he encouraged his followers to pray like Mother Etter because she was known to pray fiery prayers. Now, she would go on to mentor many of the early Pentecostal leaders. Certain people like Frank Eward and Charles Parham didn't like her, but most of the others did. Her holiness beliefs put her right in line with many in the movement, as the early Pentecostals were largely Methodist and Holiness. She felt right at home in the movement at that time. She said that people in her other earlier revivals had spoken in tongues, but she had never written that down. Sadly, tragedy would strike her again in 1914 as Samuel Etter, a husband who had supported her, would die after a long battle with illness. This hurt her a lot because she prayed long for his healing, and he was not healed. Now, this did not stop her, as much did not. And she would go on to found a church in Indianapolis, Indiana, that she would use as a conference center and a base from which to travel. Tragedy would strike her again in 1924 when her only living child, her daughter Elizabeth, would be struck by an automobile and would pass away. Mother Etter had to bury all 6 of her children and her husband before she would pass. She had lost all her family. Finally worn out, Mother Etter would pass away in 1924, not long after her daughter died, at the age of 80. She became an influential preacher in a day and age when women weren't allowed to do so. She operated in the spiritual gifts decades before Azusa Street. She preached all over and to whoever, including at a Mormon gathering in Nebraska in 1920, to Native Americans. It didn't matter to whom she had to preach to. She wanted to win the lost. She became a mentor to the blossoming Pentecostal movement, teaching up some of the early Pentecostal generals. Men and women alike should remember the Mother of Pentecost. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Pentecostal History. In our next episode, we're going to examine one of the great moves of Pentecost, the Welsh Revival, which helped to spread Pentecostalism to Wales and other parts of the UK. Thanks for watching.